What happens when a billionaire CEO, feared in boardrooms and envied in headlines, catches a fainting secretary in his arms and realizes in that fragile moment, his life may never be the same? This is not just a story of power and wealth. It is the story of Lucas Whitmore, a man with everything except the one thing he didn't know he longed for: a family. And it is the story of Emily Carter, a single mother fighting exhaustion, unpaid bills, and the weight of a sick parent, yet holding on with quiet dignity. Their worlds could not be more different: the cold luxury of a penthouse versus the cramped warmth of a Brooklyn apartment. But fate collides in the most unexpected ways. What begins with a collapse in a gleaming office hallway soon spirals into courtroom battles, whispered rumors, and choices that could tear them apart. Will Emily risk her heart and her daughter's future for love? Will Lucas risk his empire for a chance at belonging? And in a city where money buys everything, can love prove itself priceless? Stay with us as we uncover a journey of heartbreak, courage, and redemption. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe before we dive into the story. The morning air in Manhattan carried a sharp chill, the kind that stung the skin and made even the wealthiest city dwellers wrap their scarves tighter. The sky was pale gray, and the towering buildings of Midtown stood like frozen sentinels, indifferent to the lives moving below. Inside the polished glass doors of Whitmore Enterprises, warmth and brilliance replaced the cold. The marble floors gleamed, the air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, and every surface seemed to echo power. This was the empire of Lucas Whitmore, a man known in business circles as both genius and tyrant. Lucas, at 45, was a figure who inspired both admiration and fear. His reputation stretched across boardrooms from New York to London. He was tall, with hair just beginning to gray at the temples, which only sharpened his distinguished appearance. His suits, tailored in Milan, fit like armor. And yet, beneath all that polish, there was a man who went home to an empty penthouse every night, where silence greeted him more faithfully than any friend or lover ever had. To most of his employees, Lucas Whitmore was untouchable. His gaze was enough to silence a room. His clipped words could close a deal or end a career. He never lingered on small talk, never noticed the faces of the secretaries who typed his letters or fetched his coffee. At least, not until that morning. Emily Carter had been working at Whitmore Enterprises for only 3 weeks. She was 34, recently moved from Texas with her little girl, Sophie, and her aging mother, Margaret. Life in New York was nothing like the quiet town she had left. The rent in Brooklyn devoured her paycheck. The subway rides were long and crowded, and the constant worry over her mother's fragile heart weighed on her like a stone she could not set down. She carried herself with quiet dignity. Her clothes were modest, chosen carefully from discount racks, yet pressed to neatness. Her auburn hair was always pulled back, though wisps often escaped to frame her pale face. She was competent, polite, and invisible in a place where assistants came and went without leaving a mark. But Emily's nights were longer than most. After work, she hurried home to cook dinner, help Sophie with homework, and tend to Margaret when her heart palpitations flared. She rarely slept more than a few hours. Coffee and willpower kept her upright, though her body was beginning to protest. That morning, the strain finally claimed her. She had been carrying a stack of reports, balancing them carefully as she hurried down the hallway. Her steps echoed lightly on the polished floor. She felt her pulse race faster than it should, her breath catching. The world seemed to tilt. The lights overhead blurred. Lucas had just stepped out of the boardroom when it happened. He heard the papers scatter before he saw her. One moment she was walking quickly. The next, her knees buckled, and she crumpled toward the floor. Without thinking, he moved. His reflexes were faster than he expected of himself. His arms caught her just before her head struck the marble. For a man who had built a life on control, the sensation was startling. She was light, fragile in a way that unsettled him. Her skin was cool against his wrist. Her lashes rested on cheeks that had lost all color. In that instant, the hallway full of employees ceased to exist. Lucas, The man who dismissed weakness without hesitation found himself staring at a woman who had fainted in his arms, and something in his chest cracked. He could smell faint traces of soap and coffee clinging to her, a scent ordinary, yet strangely grounding. She looked nothing like the women he usually saw at charity galas or high-end dinners. There were no diamonds, no designer perfume, only exhaustion written across her features, and a kind of vulnerability that seemed both out of place and painfully honest in the heart of his empire. "Call medical," he said sharply, but his voice lacked its usual icy edge. His hand lingered at the back of her head, steadying her as if she might shatter. Around him, whispers rippled. Assistants and managers stood frozen, wide-eyed at the sight of their untouchable CEO holding a fainted secretary like a man holding something far too precious to drop. Emily stirred faintly, her lips parting as if she meant to apologize even in unconsciousness. A single word escaped Sophie. The name carried on a breath so soft he almost doubted he heard it, but it pierced him deeper than any accusation or plea ever had. For the first time in years, Lucas felt his carefully built armor give way. That single word was not business. It was not ambition. It was life, whispered from the lips of a woman who had clearly been carrying too much. When the company nurse rushed forward, Lucas did not let go immediately. He placed Emily carefully on the couch in the executive lounge, his movements uncharacteristically gentle. His mind, usually sharp and calculating, was clouded. Why had she collapsed? Why was she whispering a child's name in her sleep? And why, of all the people who had worked under him, did this one woman make him feel as though his heart had been shaken awake? He stood by longer than he should have, watching her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, watching the faint color return to her cheeks. For years, Lucas Whitmore had lived believing he needed no one. But that morning, with Emily Carter unconscious in his arms, he felt a dangerous, unfamiliar thought press against him that perhaps he had just found someone who could break through the ice that had kept him safe, but unbearably alone. The hallway outside resumed its rhythm, employees returning to their tasks. Yet, for Lucas, nothing returned to normal. He left the lounge eventually, but not before making a decision. He would find out who Emily Carter was, not because she had fainted, not because she was beautiful in a quiet, unpolished way, but because for one unguarded moment, when she had slipped from consciousness and whispered her child's name, she had reminded him of something he had forgotten what it meant to care about another life. He straightened his tie as he walked back toward his office, but the gesture felt empty. His mind was elsewhere. His life had tilted, and though Lucas Whitmore did not know it yet, his world had begun to change forever. Behind the shining glass walls of Lucas's empire lay another world. Emily's cramped apartment in Brooklyn, where unpaid medical bills sat on the kitchen table. The radiator hissed and clicked like an old kettle struggling to boil. A thin ribbon of steam rose from a chipped mug. The kitchen window fogged where the January air pressed against the glass. On the refrigerator, Sophie's crayon drawings tried to brighten the room, stick figures holding hands. A red heart with the word home spelled a little crooked. Beneath the magnets, a pharmacy receipt curled at the edges. The total read like a dare, $286. Forzialna due at pickup. Emily stood in her robe, hair twisted into a quick knot, fingers skimming the neat stacks on the table, rent notice, utility bill, hospital statement, the pamphlet about heart medication. She had read so many times the fold had turned white. She set the mail aside and opened a plastic pill organizer, checking the day's dose for her mother. 2 small tablets, one larger oval, one tiny white circle that felt like a luxury every time she held it. She counted them twice, then a third time, because accuracy was its own kind of prayer. "Morning, Mom," she said softly. Margaret sat in a worn recliner that had learned the shape of her. A knit blanket covered her knees. Her skin had the pale sheen of someone who tires easily, but her eyes were clear. She held a dog-eared paperback and a pair of reading glasses that slid down her nose whenever she smiled. "Smells like oatmeal," Margaret said, the words breathy but cheerful. With cinnamon, Emily answered, and half a banana. We'll save the other half for later. She spooned oatmeal into 2 bowls. She poured a smaller portion into a third, then hesitated, and put the spoon down. Breakfast for herself could wait. She added a splash of milk to Sophie's bowl and traced a smiley face with cinnamon, because some mornings needed small kindnesses no matter what the bank account said. Sophie patted in on sock feet, hair messy, pajamas covered in tiny stars. She climbed onto a chair and swung her legs while she ate. "It's cold, Mommy," she said through a mouthful. "Bundle up," Emily said. "Double socks. I'll warm your sweater in the dryer for a minute." Sophie grinned at that, as if a warm sweater could beat January itself. She finished quickly and hopped down, her little hands rinsing the bowl with the seriousness of a surgeon. "Nana, did you sleep okay?" "Like a cat in a sunbeam," Margaret said, and Sophie giggled. The sound loosened something tight in Emily's chest. After breakfast, Emily took Margaret's blood pressure with a cuff she had bought online. The numbers flickered. She recorded them in a small spiral notebook, its cover bent, its pages lined with neat columns of dates and readings. She listened to her mother breathe, the way a daughter learns to hear what even machines might miss. "Today's a good day," Margaret said. "Don't you worry." Emily nodded. Worry had become a background hum. You learn to do dishes, braid hair, and iron a blouse to that hum. She checked the time. Too close. She rinsed the oatmeal pot and put on coffee she wouldn't drink. Her stomach had learned the trick of pretending to be full. Sophie returned wearing a sweater too big, sleeves pushed up, backpack bouncing. Emily knelt to button her coat, her fingers lingering on each plastic circle as if gratitude could be sewn into thread. She tucked the half banana into a bag for an after-school snack. "Today is library day," Sophie announced. "I'm going to pick a book about oceans." "Oceans it is," Emily said. Waves and whales and everything blue. They rode the elevator down. The lobby smelled faintly of old carpet and winter air carried in on people's coats. On the sidewalk, the wind bit at their faces. Emily pulled Sophie's hat lower, kissed the top of it, and they hurried toward the subway. The city roared around them, delivery trucks, sirens far away, the haunting rattle of a train beneath their feet. New York never asked how you were. It asked how fast you could move. Emily left Sophie at school with a hug that lasted 1 heartbeat longer than usual. She walked to the station, joined the cluster of commuters, and let herself be carried downtown in a crush of wool, leather, and coffee lids. She kept one hand on the pole and one on her bag where she had tucked the pill organizer, because losing that would mean starting the day over with a prayer and a panic. Whitmore Enterprises rose like a promise above the avenue. Inside, the floors shone like mirrors and the reception desk looked like a sculpture. Emily's shoes squeaked softly on marble as she crossed into the world where every surface glowed. She checked her watch, widened her stride, and slipped into the bank of elevators that carried employees to their floors with silent speed. At her desk, she breathed in and chose calm like a coat. Emails already waited, rows of small fires that needed a steady hand. She typed, organized, proofread. She scheduled a call in London, a lunch she would never eat, a car service that wasn't for her. She lifted her mug and took a sip of coffee that had cooled and gone stale. The bitterness was a kind of mercy. It kept her alert. Mid-morning, her phone lit with a notification from the hospital billing portal. She didn't open it, not yet. She folded the phone face down, as if that could hold the debt at bay. She chewed a single cracker she found in her desk, then thought of Sophie's after-school snack and put the second cracker back. Across the floor, glass reflected the city like a second weather. Lucas's office sat at the far end, door closed, his name etched on steel. People lowered their voices when they passed. Emily kept her eyes on her work, but she felt the weight of that door the way you feel a storm before it breaks. Lucas, for his part, noticed what he had not noticed before. It happened in glimpses. The way Emily's shoulders lifted and fell when she thought no one was watching. The careful economy of her movements, each task done precisely, nothing wasted, as if time itself were a precious item to be rationed. The way she pinched the bridge of her nose in the shadow of her computer screen, then straightened and smiled when someone approached. At lunch, when others left for the steakhouse on the corner, she stayed. She refilled the copy paper, reset conference chairs, wiped a faint coffee ring from the polished table with a napkin she folded into a small square. She took a call, voice steady, then leaned her forehead on her hand for 10 seconds. Eyes closed, as if those 10 seconds were a pocket of sleep she could afford. That night, in his penthouse, Lucas stood before a wall of windows and watched the city glow. The living room was quiet enough to hear the soft tick of a clock he never looked at. A takeout container sat on the counter, lid closed, food untouched. He poured a glass of sparkling water and didn't drink it. He checked his phone, then set it down on the marble that seemed to echo the emptiness back at him. He could still see the moment in the hallway when Emily had folded into his arms like a bird shocked from the sky. He could still hear the faint whisper of a name Sophie breathed not as a word, but as a plea. He had told himself he would forget it. He hadn't. Instead, he found himself drifting back to it as if to a page he could not stop rereading. He tried to work. Numbers that had always obeyed him blurred. He closed his laptop and walked the length of the room, the soles of his shoes silent on the hardwood. He had everything anyone could want. He had people who answered before he finished asking. He had a calendar so full no sadness could slip in. And yet, in the reflection of the glass, he saw a man standing alone, the city shining behind him like a distant galaxy. Back in Brooklyn, Emily washed the dinner dishes by hand, steam fogging the window again. Sophie hummed from the living room, building a zoo from shoeboxes and tape. Margaret dozed, a soft smile on her lips, breath slow and steady. Emily dried her hands on a thin towel and finally opened the billing app. Numbers marched down the screen, each line a reminder that love could be measured in dollars and due dates, whether you wanted it to be or not. She locked the phone and leaned against the counter. For a moment, she let herself think about the softness of the couch in the executive lounge, the strength of hands that had kept her from the floor. Embarrassment warmed her cheeks. Gratitude cooled it. She shook her head, turned off the kitchen light, and went to braid Sophie's hair for bed. Two worlds spun on, one high and gleaming, one small and tender. They seemed as far apart as starlight and stovelight, and yet the distance was shrinking, pulled by a thread neither of them could see. The next morning, Lucas walked the corridor with his usual long stride, but his eyes moved differently. He noticed how Emily's blouse hung a little loose, as if she'd been skipping meals. He noticed the way she paused before picking up her phone, then set it down without unlocking it. He noticed that her smile for others cost her something. He didn't speak, he watched, and in the quiet place he kept locked behind success and control. A question kept asking to be answered. Why did this ordinary woman unsettle him more than any hostile takeover ever had? He didn't know, not yet, but he knew this. He could not stop wondering. Would knowing change anything, or would it change everything? Lucas Whitmore had never noticed the private struggles of his employees until Emily Carter. For years, he had walked the marble hallways of Whitmore Enterprises with a gaze that skimmed past faces. Secretaries came and went, assistants shuffled papers, managers presented charts. None of them had ever pierced the surface of his attention, but now, something had shifted. He caught himself noticing small things, an extra cup of coffee cooling on Emily's desk, the way her shoulders sagged ever so slightly after everyone else left, the faint pause she gave before lifting the phone as though bracing herself for news. At first, Lucas told himself it was curiosity, a faint residue of that morning when she had collapsed in his arms. Yet curiosity grew sharper with each passing day. One evening, as the office lights thinned and the chatter of employees faded, Lucas left his glass-walled office and saw Emily still at her desk. The glow of her monitor painted her face pale. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, but she wasn't typing. She was staring through the screen, eyes unfocused, as if her mind had slipped to a place far beyond spreadsheets and memos. Her lips moved faintly. He wondered if she was whispering a prayer. She straightened when she noticed movement. With quick efficiency, she resumed typing, masking fatigue with diligence. Yet the heaviness in her gaze lingered. Lucas returned to his office unsettled. He was a man who lived on information, who studied competitors, markets, risks. But here, in his own building, was a puzzle unsolved. He opened a drawer and pressed a button on his desk phone. "Mr. Hayes," he said when his assistant answered. "Look into Emily Carter," quietly. "Employment history, family, medical needs. I want a full report." The words tasted strange. He had never asked for details about a secretary's life, but something inside him refused silence. The next morning, a folder appeared on his desk. Lucas flipped it open. A neat file revealed fragments of a life lived far from privilege. Emily Carter, age 34, bachelor's degree, local college in Texas, recently divorced, one child, Sophie Carter, 7 years old, current dependent Margaret Carter, 65, history of cardiac issues requiring ongoing treatment, address small apartment in Brooklyn. Attached were copies of hospital statements, insurance denials, prescriptions marked not covered. Numbers filled the page. But behind them, Lucas saw a story, a daughter carrying her mother, a mother holding her child, a woman stretched thin across obligations that might break her. He closed the folder slowly. That evening, while the office emptied, Lucas called the head of human resources. "There's a gap in coverage," he said. "Fix it, quietly. Make sure Ms. Carter's family has access to extended medical support. Bill it to executive discretionary." The HR director stammered but complied. Lucas hung up without further explanation. He expected gratitude, or at least relief. What he received instead surprised him. 2 days later, Emily stood at his office door. Her hand trembled slightly on the frame, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Whitmore, may I have a word?" Lucas gestured for her to enter. She stood straight, though he could see the tension in her jaw. "I was told my mother's treatments are now covered under company insurance," she said. Her fingers clutched the strap of her bag. "I wanted to thank you, but also to be clear, I don't want special favors. I'll work hard. I'll earn my place here. But I don't accept charity." Her words were polite but firm. Lucas studied her. Most employees would have bowed under the weight of his authority, grateful for even a scrap of his attention. Yet here was a woman who, despite carrying more burdens than he could imagine, insisted on keeping her dignity intact. He felt something tighten in his chest. Admiration, a warmth foreign to him, yet undeniable. "You misunderstand," he said quietly, though he knew his tone carried little of his usual coldness. "It isn't charity. It's simply necessary." Emily inclined her head, not pressing further. "Then thank you," she said, and left before he could reply. Lucas leaned back in his chair after she was gone. He stared at the skyline beyond his window, lights flickering against the evening. A thought pressed against him. How many times had she stood at her kitchen table, bills spread out like accusations, refusing to collapse under their weight? How many mornings had she braided her daughter's hair, hiding her exhaustion behind a smile? He found himself picturing her world, far from the gleam of his penthouse. The tiny apartment, the sound of a child's laughter trying to fill the silence of worry, a mother's fragile heartbeat echoing in the night, and he, a man who had never lacked for anything, could not stop thinking about her. From then on, Lucas watched. He noticed the small tremors when she lifted her coffee cup. He saw how she rubbed her temple with 2 fingers after long calls. He marked the careful way she carried herself, never asking for help, never letting her troubles leak into her work. Each observation chipped away at his detachment. He was used to boardroom battles, to acquisitions and negotiations. But here was a battle of another kind, a quiet war waged by a woman determined to hold her life together without surrendering her pride. And for reasons he could not yet name, Lucas Whitmore found himself wanting to stand on her side of the fight. Sometimes, the smallest voices soften the hardest hearts. The first time Lucas met Sophie, The lobby smelled like citrus cleaner and wet wool. It was late afternoon, the kind of New York winter day when the light turns pewter by 4 o'clock and the wind slides through the revolving doors like a thief. Emily stood near the long leather sofa with a little girl in a purple knit hat and starry backpack. Sophie held a library book to her chest and tapped one sneaker against the marble, a quiet, patient rhythm that said she knew how to wait without fuss. Lucas slowed. He hadn't planned to. His steps always measured time and purpose. Today they faltered. Emily looked up, steadying as if she expected a reprimand for bringing a child into the temple of glass and steel. Instead, Lucas only nodded. He felt strangely aware of his own hands, as if they were too big for this soft moment. Sophie smiled first. It was small and a little shy, the kind of smile that asks a question and trusts the answer. A paper star sticker clung to her mitten. It slipped free and landed neatly on his polished shoe. She stared, then looked up at him as if she had stepped on a royal crest. "I like your sticker," he heard himself say. "It's for being brave at the dentist," she whispered, as if bravery might disappear if spoken too loud. Then, with solemn care, she peeled the star from his shoe and pressed it onto the back of her hand. "You can borrow it if you need it." Lucas laughed. It came out short and surprised, a sound he barely recognized. Emily's eyes widened and then softened. The knot at the base of her neck seemed to loosen a fraction. He noticed how the winter had left a faint pink on Sophie's cheeks, how her hat had slid crooked, how Emily gently straightened it without thinking. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Yes," Emily said. The word quiet, but clear. "My mother had an appointment, and pickup ran late. I didn't want Sophie to wait outside in the cold." "Of course," he said. 2 words, simple, but heavier than they looked. He glanced toward the coffee bar. "Hot chocolate." The question surprised him as much as it did her. Sophie's eyes brightened. She looked to her mother. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Lucas signaled to the barista. 3 cups appeared, steam curling like ribbons. He wrapped a napkin around Sophie's to guard her hands from the heat. She sipped, closed her eyes, and sighed the small, serious sigh of a child, well pleased. "Thank you," Emily said. Gratitude softened the fatigue in her voice. He meant to leave it there a moment, nothing more. Yet still he lingered, listening to Sophie point at the lobby's tall ficus and the giant black and white photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge. She named places the way children collect shells, turning them over, learning their weight. When his car pulled up, Lucas found that he'd rather stand another minute than step back into the life that always waited, polished and empty. He left before he could say anything foolish, long stride returning as if it had only tripped. 2 days later, a rare Saturday with no meetings. Lucas walked in Central Park. The air was crisp, somewhere in the low 30s, his breath visible, his gloves better suited to a boardroom than a path dusted with frost. He took the loop near the zoo to quiet a restlessness he could not shake. The city made different noises here. Children laughed and pigeons fluttered up like gray confetti, and the cold had the bright bite of a clean sheet. He saw them before they saw him. Emily in a navy coat, scarf tucked close. Sophie in a pink hat this time, skipping every other step, mittened hands windmilling as she told a story with her whole body. They stood at a cart and bought ice cream because children don't measure joy by the thermometer. Sophie chose vanilla in a sugar cone, and the first lick turned her nose a tiny, comic white. "Mr. Whitmore," Emily said when she noticed him. Surprise warmed her voice into something gentler than formality. "We didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to see me here either," he said, honest without thinking. He nodded at Sophie's cone. "A bold choice. It's for celebrating." Sophie said, "I finished my ocean book." "What's your favorite ocean?" he asked. "The biggest one," she said. "So, there's room for all the whales." He smiled. It wasn't the polished public smile he used for cameras. It was smaller, crooked, the kind that comes from the inside out. Emily watched, something like relief passing through her, as if a knot she'd grown used to had come undone. They walked together for a while. Sophie hopped on every low boulder like a mountain climber, careful but fearless. Lucas kept an eye on the patches of ice and adjusted his pace to Sophie's. It felt new to move through the world at a small person's speed. He found he didn't mind. The path curved, and the wind tugged at Emily's scarf. Without show, he lifted a corner and tucked it back into her coat. His fingers brushed wool and the brief, electric warmth of her. He let his hand fall and looked away, as if the sky had suddenly become very interesting. At a bench, they sat. The metal was cold through his coat. Sophie swung her legs, counting ducks in the pond like old friends. Lucas told a story about getting lost on this very loop when he was 10. He had ended up in the wrong part of the park and memorized the map that night, convinced knowledge could keep fear at bay. Sophie leaned closer, not afraid of the small scar on his chin, a souvenir from a fall on a schoolyard blacktop. She traced the air in front of it with one mitten, as if blessing it without touching. Emily listened. She saw how Lucas shifted to block the wind from Sophie's face. She saw how he placed the empty cone wrapper in his pocket rather than let it blow away. He was careful in ways that had nothing to do with money. She felt a warmth begin in her ribs and radiate outward, equal parts gratitude and something she was not ready to name. They circled back toward the zoo. A busker played "What a Wonderful World" on a trumpet, notes floating like breath in winter air. Sophie took Emily's hand, then reached for Lucas's without looking, the way children do when trust arrives before thought. For a heartbeat, he froze. Then his fingers closed gently around hers. Her mittens were small and absurdly thick. He felt the light tug of her step and matched it. "Mommy," Sophie said, glancing up at Emily, mischief bright in her eyes. "Is he the man who makes you smile?" Emily's cheeks went pink that had nothing to do with the cold. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Sophie, satisfied with her own answer, skipped on, hands swinging theirs like handles on a shared secret. Lucas didn't speak. He swallowed a laugh that felt tender rather than sharp. The trumpet played another verse. A dog barked somewhere behind them. A child shouted, "Watch me," and the universe obeyed. When they reached the park's edge, the city resumed its usual volume. Taxis honked. Sirens stitched the air. A gust drove needles of wind down the street's canyon. They stopped at the corner. Sophie pressed her face into Emily's coat and then looked up, eyes bright. "Thank you for walking slow," she told Lucas. "Grown-ups forget." "I'm learning," he said. They parted with a promise not spoken out loud, the kind that floats and waits. Emily led Sophie toward the subway entrance. Lucas stood a moment longer, watching the top of Sophie's pink hat bounce down the steps, watching Emily place a steadying hand at her daughter's back. His chest ached in a way that felt both painful and right, like a muscle waking up after a long sleep. That night, Emily brushed Sophie's hair while the kettle clicked toward a boil. In the living room, Margaret dozed, a soft smile smoothed across her face. Sophie told the park story 3 times: ice cream, ducks, a trumpet, a hand held. "He's funny," she said. "Not funny like silly, funny like quiet, good. Quiet, good," Emily repeated, and the words fit like the scarf Lucas had tucked into place. She set the brush down and rested her hands on Sophie's shoulders. Her heart felt both heavier and lighter, as if love were a weight and a lift at the same time. Later, when the apartment sank into its version of silence, the radiator whispering, the city breathing through the window, seems Emily sat at the kitchen table with the bills and did the arithmetic she always did. Numbers sorted into neat columns, needs into braver ones. But her mind kept slipping back to a bench in the park, a crooked smile, a mittened hand finding an unpracticed grip. Somewhere across the river, high above the streets, Lucas stood at his window and looked at the city lights while remembering a paper star sticker and a child's serious gift of bravery. He touched his chin without thinking and felt the old scar under his thumb. He imagined the sound of a trumpet and the way Emily had looked away and then back, as if hope needed a moment to gather itself. They would sleep, and morning would come with its usual demands. They would pretend their hearts had not moved, and yet something had cracked and let in light. A seed had been planted in the cold. It would not look like much at first, only a softness, only a slowing of a man's stride, a warming of a woman's guarded smile. By the next sunset, a phone would ring with news no one wanted, and the night would test how deep that softness ran. But for now, in the thin, bright hush between days, a small voice had done its work, and two lives had begun to turn toward one another. Tragedy comes uninvited, forcing hearts to show their truest strength. It was just after 9 on a Tuesday night when Emily's phone rang. She had been folding Sophie's laundry at the kitchen table, neat little piles of shirts and socks. When the call came, the number on the screen made her heart seize the hospital. She answered with shaking hands. "Your mother has been admitted," the nurse said. "Severe arrhythmia. We need you here as soon as possible." The world narrowed. She shoved the clothes back into the basket, grabbed her bag, and told Sophie to get her coat. The subway ride blurred, Sophie clutching her library book while Emily prayed under her breath. At the ER, the smell of antiseptic and the echo of hurried footsteps made everything feel unreal. Margaret lay on a gurney, pale and trembling, wires tracing her heartbeat across a monitor. Emily reached for her hand. It was cool, papery, but still squeezed back faintly. "The doctors recommend surgery," the nurse explained. "Tonight, but we'll need authorization and—" She hesitated, eyes flicking to the chart. "The insurance doesn't cover all of it. You'll have to arrange payment." The words landed like stones. Emily nodded, though her knees threatened to give way. She signed forms with a pen that felt too heavy. Her mind raced credit cards maxed, savings gone, bills waiting at home. She pressed her palms to her eyes, willing herself not to fall apart. Sophie stood beside her, silent but wide-eyed, as if she understood too much for her years. When Emily stepped into the hallway, she nearly collided with a figure she had not expected. Lucas Whitmore stood there, tall and out of place in his tailored coat, his presence drawing startled looks from the staff. "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice cracked on his name. "I heard," he said simply. "Sit down before you fall down." She shook her head. "I can't. I don't know how to pay for this." "You don't need to." His tone left no room for argument. He strode to the admissions desk, spoke a few clipped words, and laid down his black card. The clerk's eyebrows shot up, but the paperwork moved quickly after that. Emily watched, torn between gratitude and pride, her throat tight. She wanted to tell him no, to insist she could manage, but the image of her mother's fragile chest rising and falling stole the words. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." And the tears she had been holding back finally spilled. Lucas returned to her side. Without ceremony, he placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone," he said quietly. The hours stretched. They sat together in the harsh light of the waiting room. Sophie dozed with her head in Emily's lap, a blanket draped across her small body. Emily stared at the clock, listening for footsteps that would bring news. Lucas stayed. He didn't check his phone. He didn't leave for a driver or an office or the penthouse waiting uptown. He sat, coat folded on the chair, hands clasped loosely, eyes steady on the door that led to surgery. Emily broke the silence once, voice trembling. "She raised me alone, worked 2 jobs. She never complained. Now, I can't even give her what she needs without... She stopped, ashamed of the sob that rose. Lucas shifted closer. He had never been good with comfort, yet his arm moved almost on its own, wrapping around her shoulders, anchoring her against the storm. Emily pressed her face against his chest, tears soaking into the fine wool of his shirt. She shook, small gasps breaking free, and he held her tighter, not with the detachment of a benefactor, but with the fierce steadiness of a man who refused to let her collapse. For the first time, Emily let herself unravel, and for the first time, Lucas felt what it was to be someone's shelter. The night wore on, doctors came and went, shoes squeaking on linoleum. The surgery light glowed red. Emily whispered prayers into the fabric of Lucas's coat. He didn't speak, only kept his arm firm around her, as if strength could be transferred skin to skin. When the surgeon finally appeared, exhaustion lined his face, but relief colored his voice. "She's stable. The procedure went well. She'll need rest." But she pulled through. Emily sagged, tears spilling fresh. She bent over Sophie, who had woken at the sound of voices. "Nana's going to be okay," she whispered, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. Sophie smiled sleepily. "I knew it," she murmured, and curled against Emily's side. Lucas stood, tall and silent, but his eyes softened as he watched mother and daughter cling to each other. Something inside him shifted again, deeper this time. He had saved companies with numbers and contracts. Tonight, he had helped save a life. The difference settled heavy in his chest, both humbling and fierce. When dawn crept through the hospital windows, pale and hesitant, Emily looked at him. Her face was blotchy from crying, her hair messy, her blouse wrinkled from hours of leaning on him. Yet she had never seemed more beautiful to him than in that moment, raw, unguarded, human. "Why are you still here?" she asked softly. "Because you needed me to be," he answered, and the simplicity of it startled even him. She didn't reply. She only nodded, and the nod carried more gratitude than words could hold. The sun lifted higher, turning sterile walls a faint gold. Emily reached for his hand without thinking, fingers brushing his briefly before retreating. He didn't push, only let the warmth linger. A new day had come, and with it, something new in both of them, an understanding that they were no longer strangers bound by accident. They had stepped into each other's lives, and nothing would ever be the same. Love does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the quiet evenings. After the long night at the hospital, Emily found it harder to keep her walls high. Gratitude and exhaustion had thinned them. She saw Lucas not as the distant CEO in a glass tower, but as the man who had stayed when she needed someone most. So, one evening, a week later, she surprised herself by saying the words out loud. "Would you like to come for dinner?" She said it quickly, almost casually, as she packed Sophie's lunch at the office break room, but her heart thudded hard in her chest. She expected him to decline with the politeness of the powerful. Instead, Lucas simply nodded. "Yes, I'd like that." And that was how he found himself standing in the narrow hallway of a Brooklyn apartment on a Friday evening, holding a paper bag of groceries like an ordinary guest. The air inside smelled of roasted chicken and something sweet. Sophie darted around with the energy of a child set free from school, while Margaret called from the living room chair, her voice thin but cheerful. "Welcome, Mr. Whitmore." "Lucas, please," he said, setting down the bag. He took off his coat, suddenly aware of how large he seemed in the modest space. The ceilings were lower, the walls closer, but the room felt warmer than any penthouse could. Emily stirred the pot on the stove. She wore a simple blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair loose for once. Stray strands caught the light like copper threads. "You didn't need to bring anything," she said. "Old habit," he admitted. "My mother never let anyone arrive empty-handed." Her eyes softened, and something unspoken passed between them. Dinner was crowded onto a small table, mismatched plates and a pitcher of water at the center. Sophie chattered about her day, telling stories about spelling bees and playground adventures. Lucas listened, smiling at details most adults would brush aside. He asked questions that made her eyes shine brighter. Margaret spoke less, but she watched with quiet satisfaction. Emily noticed, her chest tightening. For years she had borne the weight of 2 generations. Tonight, for the first time, she felt the balance shift, as if another set of shoulders had taken some of the burden. After the dishes were cleared, Sophie insisting she was old enough to dry plates, Margaret asked for her music. "It's been weeks since I heard the piano," she said. Emily flushed. "We don't have one here." Lucas hesitated, then spoke. "I do. In my penthouse." It's been years since I touched it, but he glanced at Sophie. Would you like to hear? Her gasp was answer enough. So, the next evening, they gathered in Lucas's living room. The penthouse glittered with city lights through tall windows. Sophie pressed her nose to the glass, marveling at the skyline. Emily stood near the piano, her hand resting lightly on the polished edge. Lucas sat at the bench, stiff at first, fingers uncertain. Then the melody came back slow, halting, but true. Notes drifted through the room, soft as snowfall. Sophie curled up on the couch, listening with rapt attention. Margaret, brought along for the outing, closed her eyes and smiled. Emily stood behind him. She hadn't expected the sound to stir her so deeply. Each note seemed to peel back another layer of the man she thought she knew. He wasn't just steel and strategy. He carried music in his bones. When the final chord faded, silence wrapped around them. Lucas looked up, his gaze meeting Emily's. For a long moment, neither moved. The city glowed behind them, the hum of traffic faint, but the only sound that mattered was the echo between two hearts. Her breath caught. She had built her life around caution, around never leaning too hard on anyone. But in that quiet gaze, she felt herself leaning and wanting to. Lucas stood. He moved closer, slow, deliberate, as if afraid to startle her. Their eyes held, speaking without words. The distance closed, but not completely. It was just a moment, suspended, full of possibility and restraint. Sophie's yawn broke the spell. She rubbed her eyes, announcing she was ready for bed. Emily smiled, relief and disappointment tangled. She gathered her daughter, thanking Lucas with more warmth than formality. On the ride home, Emily stared out at the blur of streetlights. Her heart beat unevenly. She reminded herself that she was only grateful, only tired, only human. But deep down, she knew it was more. And Lucas, standing alone at his window after they left, traced his fingers over the piano keys again. He could still feel her eyes on him. He could still feel what it was like to belong, even if just for an evening. Love had not roared. It had whispered, soft and undeniable. But shadows from the past do not stay buried forever, and soon, those shadows would rise, just when hope blossoms. The past knocks on the door. It came on a Sunday evening, the kind of winter night when the streets shine with a thin glaze and the radiators rattle like old bones. Emily had just settled Margaret with tea and tucked Sophie under a quilt on the couch with a picture book. The apartment smelled of lemon cleaner and the last of a chicken soup she had stretched for 2 days. She was rinsing bowls when a hard knock shook the door. Not a neighbor's polite tap, but a demand. She knew the sound before she knew the face. Mark Harrison stood in the hall, shoulders hunched against the cold, jaw rough with stubble. His eyes slid past Emily's shoulder, taking in the smallness of the space, the lamp's soft light, the tidy stacks that said a woman had fought to make dignity out of less. He smiled without warmth. "Been a while," he said. Emily kept her voice even. "Sophie's here. Keep it civil." He leaned on the doorframe as if the wood belonged to him. "Relax. I came to talk like adults." Sophie peered over the back of the couch. Emily met her eyes. "Stay with Nana," she said gently. "I'll be right here." Emily stepped into the hall and pulled the door almost closed behind her, leaving a small slice of light. Mark's breath smoked in the air. He smelled faintly of beer and the cologne he wore when he wanted to impress someone. "I hear you've landed soft," he said. "Whitmore Enterprises, fancy boss, fancy address, even fancier friends." "It's a job," Emily said. "That's all." He snorted. "Sure. You always did know how to make the most of an opportunity." She felt the old heat rise in her face. She swallowed it down. "What do you want?" "Mark." He lifted his hands in a mock shrug. "A father's rights, for one. I've been thinking about Sophie. A child needs stability, a bigger place, better schools, maybe even a trust. A man like your boss could help with those things." The message under the words was easy to read. Emily folded her arms across her chest. Sophie has stability. She has school. She has love. She doesn't need you dangling money you don't have. He leaned closer, voice lowering. But your boss does. And people talk. They talk about the company car outside your building some nights. They talk about a certain secretary going through the private lobby. You think I can't connect dots? Her stomach dropped. She saw the grand piano, the city lights, Sophie's pink hat pressed to the glass. She had not thought of cameras or doormen who liked to gossip to earn a tip. Shame fought with anger. She did not owe this man an explanation. "Go home, Mark," she said. "You are not welcome here when your first sentence is a threat dressed as concern." He smiled again. Thinner this time. "You always were proud. It's cute. Here's the deal. You cut me in, a monthly amount. Or I file for joint custody and tell a judge you're mixing business with pleasure to get ahead. Maybe I also tell a few reporters. They love a story about a billionaire and the woman who caught him. Think how that plays at your office." He stepped back. "Tick-tock," he said. "I'll call you tomorrow." He left his breath and his cruelty in the hallway. Emily stood there with her hand on the door and her heart pounding in her throat. When she went back inside, Sophie looked up, wide-eyed. Margaret studied Emily's face, knowing more than Emily wanted her to. "It's fine," Emily said, and because she could not make it true, she made it calm. "It's over." It wasn't. By Tuesday, a blurry photo appeared on a gossip site. Emily, Sophie, and Margaret stepping into the private entrance of Lucas's building. The caption did the rest. Billionaire CEO's mystery assistant family. Night at the penthouse. The comments filled with strangers who knew nothing and said everything. At Whitmore Enterprises. Whispers rose and fell like a tide. In the elevator, 2 junior analysts stared at their shoes and then at Emily's reflection. She felt their eyes like dust. Lucas saw the post before noon. He crossed the floor with a look that made people part. "My office." "Now," he said, not unkindly. When the door clicked behind them, his voice dropped. "Are you all right?" Her mouth was dry. "It will pass." He set his phone on the desk, face down. "I can have it pulled." "You can't pull a rumor," she said. "You can only feed it." He watched her. He saw the hurt she hid, and the fight wrapped around it. "Let me issue a statement. Let me protect you." "Protecting me might hurt you," she said. "It might hurt the company. Your name lives differently in the world than mine." "Emily," she lifted a hand. "Please, let me think." In the afternoon, another knock, this time at the office, this time on the glass of her desk. Mark stood outside the security line, smug smile pressed to the glass, as if to remind her there were places he couldn't enter but could still poison. He held up his phone and tapped the article with a laugh. The guard moved him along. He left a message an hour later, clocks ticking. By evening, a man with a camera waited across from the Brooklyn building. His breath fogged in the air. He wore a hat pulled low and a jacket too thin for the cold. When Emily approached with Sophie's mittened hand in hers, the camera popped. The flash startled Sophie. Emily moved in front of her, body angled, voice even. "No photos of my child." "Is it true?" the man asked. "Are you with him? Did he pay your mother's bills?" Emily didn't answer. She ushered Sophie inside and locked the door with hands that shook. Margaret sat up straighter in her chair, alarm flaring and then softening as she saw their faces. Sophie's voice was small. "Why did the man take a picture?" "Because he was rude," Emily said. She crouched to Sophie's level. "It's not about you. You didn't do anything wrong." Sophie's eyes were wet. "I don't like it. I don't either," Emily said. She hugged her daughter hard enough to feel the small, steady knock of her heart. That night, after Sophie fell asleep and Margaret dozed, Emily took out her old laptop. She opened a blank email. "Dear Mr. Whitmore," she typed. The cursor blinked. Her throat tightened. She thought of Lucas at the piano, of his hand on her shoulder in the hospital, of the way he had blocked the wind in the park without making it a gesture. She thought of the boardroom and the stock price and the clean, cold word reputation. She thought of her daughter's flinch at the camera's flash. She backspaced the greeting. She typed, Lucas, and then deleted that too. She closed the laptop and opened it again. She stared at her hands that washed floors, braided hair, signed forms, did not tremble when storms rose. They trembled now. Margaret's voice drifted from the doorway. You're not the one who should be ashamed, she said, quiet but firm. Emily looked up. If I walk away, I protect him. If I stay, I feed the fire. You don't feed it, Margaret said. He does. The one who's knocking and threatening, he is the blaze. Don't blame the light you found for the smoke that man makes. Emily swallowed. The words found a place to land, but fear still paced. What if this ruins Lucas? What if leaving ruins you? Margaret asked. And Sophie. She finally sees a man who stays. Do not teach her that good love must be thrown away to keep bad men quiet. Tears slipped hot and uninvited. Emily wiped them away with the heel of her hand. She turned back to the laptop. The blank space waited like a cliff. Across the river. In his penthouse. Lucas read the gossip again and again, each time resisting the old impulse to handle it with force. He held his phone. He typed 3 different statements and deleted them all. He went to the piano and pressed one key. Soft. The sound small in the large room. He pictured a narrow hallway in Brooklyn and a woman trying to decide whether to protect him by breaking her own heart. He put on his coat. Emily's email sat unwritten. Her finger hovered over the keys that would spell goodbye. In the living room, Sophie turned in her sleep and whispered, Mommy, like a prayer. The radiator hissed and then went silent, as if the entire apartment were holding its breath. Emily closed the laptop. She would speak to Lucas face to face. She would choose her words on a street where cameras could not twist them into captions. She put on her coat, kissed her mother's temple, and paused at Sophie's door. Snow had begun to fall, a thin sift over the city's hard edges. She stepped into the hall and pulled the door shut behind her. Between love and fear, she stood on the landing and felt both claim her. And then she started down the stairs to decide which would lead her forward. When lies spread, love must decide whether to bend or to stand. By Monday morning, Whitmore Enterprises felt less like a temple of glass and steel and more like a pressure cooker. News trucks idled on the curb, their antennas stabbing the gray sky. Journalists clustered at the revolving doors, shouting questions no one answered. Inside, whispers moved faster than emails. Did you see the article? They say she's living with him. Think the board will tolerate this. Emily walked past with her head high. Sophie's smile tucked deep in her heart as armor. But each hushed word struck like a pebble against glass, small but relentless. Lucas felt it too. His board of directors sent pointed messages about public perception. Investors hinted at stability concerns. Every headline used the same photograph: Emily, hair windblown, holding Sophie's hand. He wanted to smash the paper, but he knew breaking glass wouldn't break a rumor. That evening, in the quiet of his office, Emily came to him. She closed the door with careful finality. Lucas, she said, voice low, this can't continue. He looked up from his desk, eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. What can us? This, she gestured vaguely, as if naming it would make it heavier. Your company, your reputation. They're tearing it apart because of me. His jaw tightened. Because of lies. Not because of you. She shook her head. It doesn't matter. The damage is the same. They'll drag Sophie into this. They'll drag my mother. And they'll never stop until you push me away. I won't let you lose everything for me. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Lucas rose, every inch of him steady, like a man who had faced storms before. He came around the desk and stood close enough for her to see the silver at his temples, the lines carved by years of battles won and lost. Emily, I've built empires on numbers and contracts. None of it means a damn thing if I can't protect the people who matter. Her breath caught. She wanted to believe him, but guilt pressed hard. Mark filed for custody today. She whispered, "He's using all this against me. He says I'm unstable, that Sophie would be better with him. And now with you, he'll say I'm reckless, unfit, desperate enough to cling to a powerful man. The court will listen." Lucas's eyes darkened. "He won't win? You can't know that." Her voice cracked. "If he does, I lose Sophie. I can't risk it." Silence stretched between them, heavy and raw. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted past the skyline, fragile against the storm brewing below. Finally, Lucas spoke. "Do you trust me?" Emily blinked, tears threatening. "Yes, but trust doesn't change a judge's ruling." He reached for her hand. His palm was warm, steady. "Then trust that I will stand beside you. In that courtroom, in front of the world. I won't let you fight alone." Her tears fell then, unbidden, sliding hot down her cheeks. She wanted to pull away, to protect him as she had promised herself, but her fingers tightened around his instead. Betraying the truth she had hidden, she didn't want to walk away. The days that followed blurred into a countdown. Papers filed, statements drafted, lawyers consulted. Emily sat through meetings where her life was dissected, her finances, her apartment, her hours, her choices. Each question felt like an accusation. Each answer felt like peeling back skin. At night, she lay awake listening to her mother's breathing in the next room, Sophie's soft murmur in sleep. She stared at the cracked ceiling and wondered if love was worth the cost. She thought of Lucas, steady at her side, and the thought both comforted and frightened her. Lucas bore the storm in his own way. Reporters shouted his name as he entered buildings. Analysts speculated about his personal entanglements. He had weathered hostile takeovers and economic downturns, but never something this intimate, this vulnerable, and still. He refused to retreat. One night, after a long strategy session with lawyers, Lucas drove to Brooklyn. Emily opened the door to find him standing in the hall with snow melting in his hair. He looked tired but resolute. "You should be home," she whispered. "I am," he said simply, stepping inside. Sophie ran to him, clutching a drawing of Wales. "I made this for you," she said. He crouched, taking the paper with care. "It's beautiful." Emily watched him, this man, who had boardrooms at his command, now kneeling on a worn rug, listening to a 7-year-old describe oceans. Something inside her cracked wider. Later, after Sophie was asleep and Margaret had retired, they sat at the kitchen table. Bills still lay stacked, but tonight neither reached for them. Lucas reached for her hand instead. "Tomorrow," he said, "we face him, but you won't be alone." Emily looked down at their joined hands. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe it. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the panes. The storm had arrived, full and fierce. But inside, at that table, there was steadiness enough to face it. And as dawn crept closer, both knew the battle for Sophie, for truth, for love, would be decided in the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, love and truth faced their sharpest test. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Its high ceilings made every cough, every shuffle of feet, sound louder than it should. The benches creaked beneath the weight of people waiting, reporters filling the back rows like vultures smelling the promise of blood. Emily sat at the table for the respondent. Her hands clutched each other in her lap, knuckles white. She wore her best blouse, ironed twice until the fabric lay flat, though no fabric could cover the fear pressing at her chest. Beside her, Lucas sat tall and still, his suit sharp, his presence anchoring. Yet Emily felt small, as if every eye in the room judged her unworthy before a word was spoken. Mark entered with a swagger that made Emily's stomach twist. His lawyer, a man in a pinstripe suit with an oily smile, carried a stack of papers like weapons. Mark didn't look at Emily. He smirked at Lucas instead. a smirk that said this wasn't about Sophie, not really. It was about power. The judge, a gray-haired woman with glasses perched low, called the session to order. Her gavel struck once, and the room hushed. Mark's lawyer began. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Harrison, seeks custody of his daughter, Sophie Carter. He believes Miss Carter, while loving, cannot provide the financial stability, the environment, or the future that Sophie deserves. Miss Carter lives in a small apartment. She works long hours. She is, by all accounts, stretched too thin. Contrast that with Mr. Harrison, who has steady employment and a plan for his daughter's future. Emily's breath caught. Lies wrapped in polished words felt more dangerous than the blunt cruelty she knew. She wanted to stand, to shout the truth that Mark had left them, that he cared more for his pride than his child. But her throat locked. The lawyer went on, we also must consider the troubling association Miss Carter has with her employer, Mr. Whitmore. Rumors, photographs, speculation. Is this the example we wish for Sophie? That survival comes through attachment to wealth and influence? The words echoed. Emily stared at her hands. Her heart thudded so loudly she barely heard her own lawyer's quiet objection. Shame flooded her, even though she had done nothing wrong. Mark leaned back, satisfied. His eyes flicked toward Emily, smug. She felt her chest hollow. Then Lucas stood. The room shifted at once. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Even the judge looked over her glasses. My name is Lucas Whitmore, he said, voice steady. Yes, I am Miss Carter's employer. And yes, I care for her. Deeply. I have witnessed her devotion as a mother. I have seen the sacrifices she makes daily for her child and her mother. If wealth alone were the measure of parenthood, perhaps I would stand unchallenged. But I tell you, wealth is meaningless compared to the love this woman gives her daughter. Emily's eyes filled. He hadn't planned this. She knew. He was risking his name, his empire, for words spoken in public record. Lucas continued, I will not allow insinuations to stand unchallenged. Miss Carter's dignity does not rest on her association with me. It rests on her actions, her sleepless nights, her tireless work, her constant care. Sophie Carter deserves the mother who has never abandoned her. And I will stand by them both, no matter the cost to myself. The room buzzed, a hive of whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Mark's lawyer sputtered about relevance. The judge lifted a hand, silencing the noise. Then, in a small, clear voice, Sophie spoke. Can I talk? All heads turned. She stood near the front, hands folded around the stuffed dolphin she carried everywhere. Her feet barely reached the floor. The judge peered down gently. Child, this is unusual. Please, Sophie said, I want to tell the truth. After a pause, the judge nodded. Very well. Briefly, Sophie walked forward. Each step seemed to echo louder than the lawyer's speeches. She looked up at the bench, her small voice carrying in the stillness. My mom takes care of me every day. She makes me breakfast even when she's tired. She braids my hair and listens to my stories. She never forgets to kiss me goodnight. When I'm scared, she holds me until I fall asleep. Emily covered her mouth, tears slipping past her fingers. Sophie turned toward Lucas. And, Mr. Lucas, he makes Mommy smile. He reads me stories. He held my hand in the park so I wouldn't slip. He stayed with us at the hospital when Nana was sick. He doesn't have to, but he does. That means he cares. Silence thickened. Reporters lowered their pens. Even Mark shifted uncomfortably. Sophie looked back at the judge, her eyes bright but steady. I don't want to live with someone who left us. I want to live with Mommy. She's my home. Her words hung in the air, fragile and unbreakable. No one spoke. For once, not even Mark's lawyer had an argument ready. The judge leaned back, hands folded, her expression unreadable. Emily wanted to run to her daughter, to hold her close, but the decorum of the courtroom held her still. Instead, she whispered a silent thank you to Sophie, to God, to whatever power had given her daughter such courage. The gavel tapped lightly. We will recess. Decision to follow. The benches creaked as people stood. Reporters whispered furiously, but softer than before, as if afraid to disturb the echo of Sophie's words. Emily turned to Lucas. Their eyes met, brimming with the same mix of fear and hope. The future balanced on a thin edge, and as the courtroom emptied, it felt as though every life inside waited for the next strike of the gavel to decide everything. When masks fall, the truth cannot be hidden. The courtroom was colder the next morning, or perhaps it only felt that way to Emily. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. She sat at the respondent's table, hands clasped in her lap, steady this time. No shaking, no crumbling. She had cried all she would cry the day before. Today, she was ready to stand. Mark entered late, as if the room waited for him. His lawyer carried a new folder, thick with documents meant to wound. Mark smirked, confident, as if Sophie's words had been nothing but childish noise. He took his seat with a careless sprawl, eyes flicking to Emily, then to Lucas, daring them to believe they had won. The judge adjusted her glasses. Proceed, she said. Mark's lawyer launched into a speech about financial capacity and future security. He painted a picture of Sophie growing up in comfort, college tuition guaranteed, opportunities wide as the horizon. He held up Emily's modest income like a mirror meant to shame her. But something had shifted. Emily didn't flinch this time. She listened, spine straight, chin lifted. The words slid past her like wind against stone. Then Lucas rose. The hush was instant. His voice carried without force, calm but unshakable. Your Honor, with respect, what we've heard is not about a child's best interest. It is about appearances. It is about wealth used as leverage. But a parent is not measured by bank statements. He stepped closer to the bench. I know because I once believed money could fill every silence in my life. It did not. What filled it was the laughter of a little girl who trusted me enough to hold my hand. What filled it was the courage of a woman who has given everything, every day, without fail. Sophie Carter's home is not in numbers. It is in her mother's arms. Mark shifted, uneasy. The judge turned her gaze to him. Mr. Harrison? Do you wish to add anything? Mark stood too quickly. Yes. Look, He cleared his throat, trying for sincerity. I just want what's best for my daughter. Emily's struggling. And frankly, she's letting herself get distracted. She's distracted how the judge asked sharply. Mark's jaw worked. She's entangled with her boss. Everyone knows it. It's inappropriate. It shows poor judgment. She's using him to cover her bills, to keep her afloat. That's not stability. That's desperation. And if he walks away, what then she can't provide on her own? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed. And what financial contributions have you made, Mr. Harrison? Mark blinked. Well, I've had setbacks, business opportunities. But I plan to answer the question. Mark's voice thinned. None, not lately. And your visitation record. He shifted again. It's been complicated. Work travel. The lawyer tried to intervene, but the judge lifted a hand. Enough. Sit down. Mark's face flushed. His mask slipped. He muttered something under his breath about Emily always making herself the victim. Lucas spoke again, his tone sharper now. What you call desperation, I call devotion. Emily Carter has carried every burden you abandoned. She has raised Sophie alone. She has worked herself past exhaustion to ensure her daughter never feels unloved. That is not weakness. That is strength. Emily's throat tightened. She looked at Lucas, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but recognition, like he finally understood the weight she bore and admired it. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. The room stilled. I have heard enough. Time stretched thin, every second a taut string. The judge's voice was clear. Custody is awarded to Emily Carter, full and permanent. Mr. Harrison. You have demonstrated neither consistency nor genuine concern for your daughter's well-being. Miss Carter, despite financial challenges, has shown unwavering commitment, stability, and love. That is what defines a parent. The gavel struck, one sharp sound, final, for a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Emily's lawyer exhaled audibly. Margaret wept softly in the back row. Sophie clapped her hands once, small and fierce, before Emily gathered her into her arms. Reporters scribbled furiously, but their words seemed distant. All Emily felt was Sophie's warmth pressed against her chest, her daughter whispering, "We did it, Mommy," over and over. Mark stormed out, slamming the door, his footsteps echoing like a retreat. His lawyer followed, muttering. The smell of defeat trailed with them. Lucas remained. He did not look triumphant. He looked relieved, as if a weight he hadn't realized he carried had been lifted. Emily turned to him. Their eyes locked across the chaos of the courtroom. There was no need for words. Everything was there. The fight, the fear, the faith that had carried them through. She mouthed, "Thank you." He shook his head once, a small gesture. "Always." The room slowly emptied, leaving behind the echo of Sophie's laughter and the soft creak of wooden benches. Emily stood, Sophie's hand in one of hers, Margaret's frail fingers in the other. Lucas stepped beside them, tall, steady, belonging in a way he never had in all his gleaming boardrooms. The storm had passed, and though the world outside still carried its noise and its judgments, in that moment they knew they had stood against it and not broken. Together, they had won. Family is not only where we come from, but where love chooses to stay. The echo of the gavel still lived somewhere in Emily's chest, a small, steady drum that reminded her the storm had broken. The next morning felt different, even though the city sounded the same. Sirens stitched the air. A bus sighed at the corner. The radiator hissed in its usual rhythm. Yet, when Sophie slid into her chair for breakfast, she did it with a grin that reached both ears. "Do we still have victory pancakes?" she asked. "We do," Emily said, flipping one that shaped itself like a crooked heart. "Extra cinnamon." Sophie leaned over the table, solemn and delighted. For luck. Margaret sat in her chair with a blanket across her knees, color back in her cheeks. Her breath came easier now. The scar on her chest had faded to a pale line of stubbornness. She watched her girls, eyes bright, and reached for her pill organizer without prompting. When Emily handed her water, she squeezed her daughter's fingers. It was a small squeeze, ordinary and miraculous. Lucas arrived with a bag of oranges and a carton of eggs he had actually remembered to buy. He paused in the doorway, knocking once out of habit, even though habit was changing. "Come in," Emily called. Her voice held none of the old caution. It carried a welcome that warmed the hallway. He stepped inside and set the bag on the counter. The room was small, and he filled it not with power, but with the ease of someone expected. Sophie shot up and wrapped his waist in a fierce hug. "Real dad pancakes day," she announced. He swallowed, the words landing where he had never thought words could land. He bent and kissed the top of her head. Then, "I'm at the right address." They ate together at the wobbly table. Lucas poured syrup with a careful hand and cut Sophie's pancake into tidy squares. He listened while Margaret told a story from years before Texas heat. A broken fan, a bowl of ice cubes saved for a feverish child. He asked questions, not to fill silence, but to keep the thread going. The story ended with laughter that turned the apartment into something more than four walls. After breakfast, Lucas washed dishes with sleeves rolled to his elbows. He moved slower here. He let the soapy water scald his skin a little, as if heat could teach him something about staying. He rinsed plates and lined them on a towel. Emily dried beside him, their shoulders touching now and then in quiet, harmless sparks. They didn't name it, they didn't need to. The name was already in the room, written on every ordinary thing. Days slipped into a new rhythm. Lucas met Emily and Sophie at the corner after school, when he could. He learned the trick of tying a scarf so it stayed put on a windy day. He waited at the pharmacy for Margaret's refills and took the heavy bag without ceremony. He discovered the strange dignity of a grocery list. Each line, a promise milk, bananas, oatmeal, the exact tea Margaret liked. On Saturdays, he carried a small toolkit to the apartment, more eager than skilled. He tightened a cabinet hinge that had squeaked for years. He put felt pads under chair legs so they wouldn't scrape. He straightened the picture frames that never stayed level. Sophie handed him screws as if they were treasure. He called her foreman, and she wore the title like a crown. At night, when the city turned its lights to stars, Emily read on the couch with her feet tucked under her. Lucas sat on the floor with Sophie and built oceans out of blue construction paper. He taught her the names of whales and how to fold a paper boat that actually floated in a sink. Margaret watched with a smile that said something like gratitude and something like relief. At first, the headlines kept trying to follow them. Reporters waited outside the tower. Speculation hummed. But scandal is a poor sprinter. It tires when goodness refuses to provide it with fresh air. The noise thinned. People moved on. What stayed was the quiet work of a family learning each other's steps. One Tuesday, Emily visited the hospital for a follow-up with Margaret. The nurse checked vitals and smiled. "You've been doing everything right," she said. "Rest, walk when you can, take the good days as gifts." On the way home, Margaret's hand rested in Emily's arm, light and trusting. The winter had softened. Trees held a fragile light that hinted at green. Emily felt hope rise in her, the way sap rises in branches, slow, determined, unstoppable once it begins. "Invite him for dinner," Margaret said without looking at her. "On purpose." Emily laughed. "I have been—" "No," Margaret said. "Invite him like you mean it." That night, Emily cooked a proper meal. Roasted chicken, real mashed potatoes, green beans with almond slivers she toasted in a skillet that wanted to scorch if you took your eye off it. She set the table with the good plates and the 2 unchipped glasses that caught light in a way that made water look like something rare. She wore a simple dress with sleeves that brushed her wrists and left her hair down. When Lucas walked in, he stopped. The room smelled like rosemary and butter. Sophie ran past him on a mission to fetch napkins, banging a drawer in her private hurry. Margaret turned a page in her book without reading it. Emily stood at the stove with a wooden spoon, and when she turned, Lucas felt the old world slip a little. "You cooked like a holiday," he said. "Maybe it is one," she answered softly. Dinner tasted like celebration without fireworks. Afterward, Sophie pulled out a board game, and Lucas learned the rule that house rules always win. When Sophie declared bedtime, he read from the ocean book with exaggerated seriousness until her giggle cracked through and softened the edges of the day. He tucked the blanket under her chin with a care he'd learned from watching Emily. In the doorway, Emily stood with one hand on the frame, her eyes bright in the lamplight. They ended up at the kitchen sink again, rinsing plates. Luke passed a glass to Emily. Their fingers brushed and stayed. Time slowed the way it does when truth approaches slowly so as not to frighten you. "Emily," he said, not as a question, but as a beginning. "I know," she whispered, and her smile held joy and gratitude and a trust she had not given in years. "We're here." He understood. Not a promise written on paper yet, not a ring, a covenant that had been living in there every day, waiting for them to notice it. The covenant of showing up, of small sacrifices, of laughter that made room for tears. Later, he sat at the piano in his penthouse with the windows thrown open to the sound of the city. The room felt less like a museum now, and more like a place where life had actually happened. He played the melody he had not known he remembered until Emily had stood behind him that night. The notes carried differently this time. They sounded like a door opening and a person stepping through. He stopped and looked around. There were new things in the apartment, a second toothbrush in the bathroom, a crayon under the couch, a spare sweater on the back of a chair. None of them matched the careful catalog that had once defined his life. He loved each one, not for its price, but for the evidence it held. People lived here now, people he loved. He went to the kitchen and poured water into 3 glasses. as if instinct had outrun thought. He smiled at himself and shook his head. Then he reached into a drawer he had not opened in years and found an old recipe, his mother's pancakes, written in her looping script. He smoothed the paper flat and felt a pulse of something tender and old. He had spent his life outrunning the ache of empty rooms. He hadn't understood that the cure was not speed. It was presence. The next weekend, they walked past the small church in Brooklyn where Margaret had once lit a candle on a hard day. Its doors were open. A shaft of sun fell across the aisle, dust spinning like quiet confetti. Sophie tugged Lucas forward. "Can we go in?" she asked. They stepped into the cool hush. Emily dipped her fingers in the font and touched her forehead lightly. Lucas stood in the back, hat in his hands, the posture of a man learning reverence. He didn't make a promise out loud. He didn't need to. The promise was already in the way he stood between the pew and the door, making a place for them, on the steps. The air smelled faintly of bread from the bakery next door. Margaret rested, catching her breath, and laughed at nothing at all, the way the light made you laugh when you had survived to see it. Lucas looked at Emily. It was not a look that asked. It was a look that said yes. He had found what he had been missing and hadn't known how to name a home that answered him back. Spring waited just around the corner, gentle and sure. The trees would uncurl. The city would trade its gray for green. There would be papers to sign, and clothes to iron, and school lunches to pack. There would be hard days still. But the center would hold. A future had begun, not with thunder, but with a table set for 4 and a piano played for 3. And from here, it would only grow. The greatest fortune a man can hold is love that stays. The church in Brooklyn was not grand. Its walls were simple, painted cream, with wooden pews that bore the polish of decades of hands resting in prayer. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, scattering soft colors across the aisle. A handful of neighbors filled the seats. The florist had placed jars of daisies along the window ledges, their bright heads turning toward the light. Emily stood at the back, her arm linked with Margaret's. She wore a dress the color of ivory tea, simple and unadorned, the fabric chosen more for comfort than spectacle. Sophie tugged at the hem, grinning in her flowered shoes, her hair crowned with a homemade wreath of baby's breath. The organ began a slow hymn. Heads turned. Emily's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a fullness she had never known. She walked the aisle, her daughter skipping gently ahead, scattering paper hearts she had cut herself. Lucas waited at the front. He wore a dark suit, but nothing about him was cold now. His eyes searched for Emily, as if she were the only soul in the room. When their gaze met, Emily felt steadiness flood her, stronger than nerves, stronger than doubt. Margaret kissed her daughter's cheek and settled into the front pew. Sophie darted to Lucas's side and pressed something into his palm before anyone else noticed. It was a fountain pen, worn smooth with years of use. "This was Mommy's," Sophie whispered. "She said it helped her write her first stories. I want you to have it." Lucas swallowed hard. His thumb traced the pen's barrel, and he slipped it carefully into his jacket pocket as if it were treasure beyond price. The ceremony unfolded without grandeur, but with weight. Words were spoken about love, about vows made in quiet kitchens as much as in bright sanctuaries. Lucas listened, every syllable sinking deep. Emily breathed each promise as if she were exhaling years of struggle and inhaling hope at last. When it was his turn to speak, Lucas hesitated only a moment. His voice, when it came, was low but clear. "I have built towers that touch the clouds. I have signed contracts worth more than most men dream, but none of it gave me what I found the day Emily Carter fainted in my arms. That moment, unexpected, inconvenient, unpolished, was when I realized I had been waiting for her all along. She brought me back to life. She gave me a family when I thought I'd never belong. And Sophie," he glanced down, smiling through the ache in his throat, "you gave me a name I never thought I deserved. Real Dad. I will spend the rest of my days proving it true." Emily's tears slipped freely now, not of sorrow, but of release. She spoke next, her her voice soft but unshaking. I spent years believing survival was enough, that if I worked hard and kept moving, I could carry it all. But then a man who could have stayed distant chose instead to stay close. He saw me when I was invisible. He saw Sophie when others ignored her. And he showed me that love is not weakness. It's the only wealth that lasts. The minister nodded, and the vows sealed themselves in the silence that followed, deeper than any signature. When Lucas lifted Emily's veil, the world hushed. Sophie clapped her hands once in delight. Margaret wiped her eyes with a lace handkerchief she had saved for this day. The kiss was not showy. It was steady, gentle, and sure. It carried the weight of sleepless nights, hospital corridors, courtroom battles, and laughter at a wobbly kitchen table. It carried everything they had been and everything they would be. Applause rose, not loud, but heartfelt. Neighbors smiled. Reporters had been left outside, the story theirs alone to tell. Afterward, they walked into the spring air, petals drifting from unseen hands. Sophie clutched Lucas's left hand and Emily's right, swinging their arms like a bridge she had built herself. Margaret followed slowly, her steps firm but steady, leaning on no one now. The reception was in the church hall, tables dressed with white cloths, food made by friends and neighbors. Children darted between chairs. Someone strummed a guitar. Laughter filled the room, weaving a tapestry richer than any ballroom could offer. Lucas gave a toast with water instead of wine. He held up Sophie's paper hearts, collected from the aisle, and smiled. "This is my fortune," he said simply. "Not stocks, not buildings. This—" Emily reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. Sophie leaned against him, eyes heavy with joy and exhaustion. Margaret raised her glass of lemonade, voice firm to love that stays. As evening settled, Emily and Lucas stepped outside for a breath of air. The city hummed beyond, alive as ever. But here, in the glow of the street lamp, the world felt quiet. Emily leaned into him, her head against his chest, listening to the rhythm that had once steadied her in a hospital waiting room. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The old life, the distance?" He shook his head. "I only wonder why it took me so long to find this one." She smiled, eyes closing, trust spilling into every line of her face. The night carried them forward, not into a fairy tale, but into a life of real mornings and real burdens, softened by the wealth of shared strength. The greatest fortune, after all, was not the empire Lucas had built. It was the family he had been given, the love that had chosen to stay. And for everyone who witnessed it, whether in the church that day or through the quiet telling, later it was a reminder, true love does not dazzle with gold. It endures with kindness. It holds on through storms. And when it stays, it turns ordinary lives into shining stories. Life often teaches us that true wealth is not measured by what we own, but by who stands beside us when the storms come. Lucas had power, status, and fortune. Yet his soul was empty until love entered quietly through the most ordinary doorway, a fainting secretary, a child's innocent smile, a mother's quiet courage. Emily, though burdened with hardship, carried strength born from love and dignity, showing that resilience and compassion can shine brighter than any bank account. Their story reminds us that families are not defined solely by blood, but by the choices we make to love, to protect, and to stay. It tells us that vulnerability is not weakness. It is often the place where real connection is born. For many of us, especially as we grow older, it is easy to measure life by accomplishments or possessions. But in the end, what matters most is simpler the laughter around a dinner table, the hand that steadies us when we falter, the promise that someone will not walk away when life gets hard. The lesson is clear. Love that stays is life's greatest fortune, and it is never too late to choose it. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this journey of love, resilience, and hope. Stories like this remind us that even in the hardest seasons, kindness and faith can light the way. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need encouragement, And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Your support means the world to us, and together, we'll keep shining stories alive.